So I'd like to welcome you to the 5th Annual Legal Studies Distinguished Visitor Lecture, sponsored by the Faculty of Social Science Published Lecture Series and Carpenters Union Local number 397. And I'd now like to invite Andrea Slane, Associate Dean, to introduce our speaker, Camille Nelson.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's great to see a room full of people here. That's great. I'll tell you a little bit of background first on the Legal Studies Distinguished Visitor Lecture Series. So that series began in 2016 with the aim to host an annual lecture from a prominent legal thinker addressing a timely subject, and so to bring an opportunity to hear about and discuss those issues to our students, our faculty, to the Durham legal community, and to the general public. So I think we've been successful with that. We've had two former Supreme Court justices, Ian Binney and Frank Iacobucci. We had the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Brian Beamish, and disability rights activist David Lepofsky. And so we're honored today to welcome the Dean and Professor of Law at American University, Washington College of Law, Camille Nelson. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. So prior to her appointment at the American University, Dean Nelson was the first woman and person of color to serve as Dean of Suffolk University School of Law in Boston. She has held academic appointments at Hofstra Law School and Washington University in St. Louis. Her work has been published in many leading academic journals, such as the Berkeley Journal of Criminal Law, Yale Journal of Law and Feminism, and the New York University Review of Law and Social Change. She's currently a co-editor of the Journal of Legal Education of the Association of American Law Schools, and the National Jurist named her one of the, quote, most influential people in legal education. Long before her many achievements south of the border, Dean Nelson got her start very close to where we are today. She grew up in Pickering and earned a BA with high distinction from the University of Toronto. Next, she earned a law degree from the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law and went on to clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada. As luck would have it, she clerked for Justice Frank Iacobucci, who was one of our previous speakers in this series. She has an LLM from Columbia University, and among her many accomplishments, along with her sister, who is also a professor, an art historian at McGill, Charmaine Nelson, she co-edited a book titled Racism A Critical Interdisciplinary Anthology of Race and Racism in Canada. So you can look that up and read it if you have not. So Dean Nelson is an expert on the intersection of critical race theory and cultural studies, with particular emphasis on health law, criminal law and procedure, and comparative law. And we're fortunate to have her with us today to give the 2020 Legal Studies Distinguished Visitors Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dean Camille Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for staying. I apologize for the technical glitches. Technology's wonderful when it works, and we just had to figure some things out, so hopefully things will go a little bit more smoothly. It's really nice to be back home. So I went to school in Oshawa, I went to school in Whitby, I went to school in Scarborough, I went to school in Toronto, I went to school in Ottawa. So this is very much familiar to me, and it's nice to be here. So let me talk to you a bit about what I'm trying to do with this research, and I want to tell you about why I became interested in the intersection of critical race theory, disability rights insofar as a particular focus on mental health, what I like to refer to as mental vulnerability is concerned, and policing. And it's funny because the world is really small, and when I practiced in Toronto, I actually practiced with at McCarthy Tatro, and before Mr. Justice Binney went to the Supreme Court, he was a partner, a corner office partner, as they would say, at McCarthy's, where I worked. So I actually had the pleasure of working with him. And McCarthy's did a lot of medical malpractice defense work. And we tended to specialize in litigation. And so I had like a subspecialty of like silicone breast implants and anesthesia, and representing also psychiatrists. And one of the psychiatrists who was an expert of ours we were prepping on a weekend and we were talking. He was like, so what do you really care about? And I started talking to him about what I really care about in terms of identity work and race and rights and policing. And we were talking about mental health. And he said, all it takes is 3 things. 3 things that we care about in our lives to go wrong, and anybody, however we describe sanity, which is a fluid state, can be propelled into a situation where we're not necessarily entirely well in terms of our mental well-being. And stress can be good. You're getting married to the love of your life, right? You're about to run a marathon. It could be wonderful stress. You're moving for a new job that was like your dream job. Good stress. Or it could be bad, right? You're the runner or you're the tennis player and you've got tennis elbow. Something happens, you've lost your relative and you lost your job. So it could be good or bad, but all of us can slip into a state of mental unhealth. So that's why I prefer to talk about mental well-being as mental vulnerability, right? Sometimes you come into that state, sometimes you go out of that state. So over the last several years, I've been particularly concerned with the ways in which police have been engaging with people who are mentally vulnerable in their interactions on the street. So I'm trying to figure out how the particular intersecting vulnerabilities around identity and mental vulnerability intersect. Okay, so that's the project I've been preoccupied. To the extent as dean, I get to focus on my scholarship, but I've written in this area for a number of years, and I'm currently doing another project that, to be totally honest, it's depressing, so I keep putting it off. And so I want to also acknowledge sort of the reality of sometimes when you're doing work and you see yourself in it. I also teach criminal law, and teaching some of the areas in criminal law, you can't act like you're a robot, right? It impacts you reading about child abuse. It impacts you reading and studying about sexual assault and domestic violence and rape. It impacts you studying about racism in the criminal justice context and every other context. So I will tell you, I'm doing this piece for Georgetown, and it was like due last May. And then there's something else happens, and something else happens. And that Chachana Jefferson is shot in her house playing video games with her son, or with her nephew. And then I'm writing about that, and I put it off, and I put it off. So they've been really nice in indulging me as I go into and out of this work, because it is challenging. So I want to recognize that at the outset. So my theory is that people who are negatively racialized, and by that I mean, frankly, racialized negatively as non-white, in their interactions with police are often slip into this construction by the police as crazy. And I mean that respectfully in quotes, and I'm going to talk to you about why in the literature I use that language. And so much of it has to do with a lack of obedience, like how dare you respond to me like that, audacity, and rascality. And the language of rascality has reverberations in some of the historical texts at the medical legal intersection. I'll talk to you about that. And what my theory is, in some of the work I've done, is that these interactions, through the construction of the other as particularly problematic, as crazy in quotes, leads to what I talk about as a felonizing process in the States, right? So in the States you have misdemeanors and felonies. In Canada you have summary and indictable offenses, right? But it slips the person from a low-level offense, here summary offense, into an indictable offense in Canada, or from a misdemeanor into a felony in the States. So that's the lane change, that's the locker search, that's something fairly benign that de-escalates and devolves into something much more serious and potentially precarious. And in my articles, I refer to this as suspect identity construction sick, okay? So my theory in some of the work is that, I think we need to think more deeply about the dynamics at play in those interactions. As someone who is constructed a suspect, what happens actually is a person then becomes constructed as a suspect, right? That then becomes constructed as a criminal subject. And to think about the ways in which disability is racially constructed or informed, and racism, frankly, becomes disabling. And I'm going to talk to you more about racism being societally disabling in the context of sociobiological determinants of health and basically the intersection of the medical legal literature. There's a wonderful professor at UCLA, Dr. Beth Rebay, and she has this quote that I think is informative, right? The construction of white normalcy is synonymous with ability, and the construction of people of color is often correspondingly synonymous with abnormality, dangerousness, deviance, or infectious moral sickness, damaged or less worthy or inferior bodies, less capable and intelligent minds, all of which bleed into the construction of disability, okay? And I wanted to start in this quote, at the lower left. So discrimination, what happens with discrimination? When we are discriminated against by virtue of whatever bits of our identity, and we're all multiply constituted, right? We're all more than one thing at the same time. Our sexual orientation, our class, our language, our religion, our ethnicity, our race, right? Our everything, right? So when we are discriminated against, we are exposed to noxious chemical, physical imbalances and psychological slants and offenses. Frankly, they impact our well-being, our biological integrity, right? And these pathways lead to inequalities in health across the life course. It's referred to as the biology of inequality. And you can just think about just when you're stressed. Good stress, bad stress, stress not related to your identity, right? I feel it in my stomach, right? If I'm preparing for an exam, I feel it in my shoulders. Some people get migraines. Some people, the back of their eyes hurt. Like your stress lives in your body in different ways, right? Regardless of when it's with respect to your identity or not. So this is just talking about how does stress manifest in your body with the added layer of stress for which you, by virtue of your existence, are exposed to, right? The top left, being a racial or ethnic minority may increase stress as well as negative reactions to stress, right? Negative physical and mental outcomes have been noted increasingly over the last several years, and there's increasing literature, public health literature, psychiatric literature, sociological literature, epidemiological literature that's urging our need to understand the additional complications that individuals from these populations may experience compared to those in the majority population, right? So we all have stress. What gets layered on for women? What gets layered on for people who with language, who have different languages than us, different religions, whatever we do to construct the other, right? If we go to the top right, I want to talk to you a bit about the social model of disability and how, when we think about how we construct our societies in exclusive ways as opposed to thinking about universal design, right? And how do we construct communities where everybody can navigate and integrate and belong in holistic ways, right? So the social model of disability looks at how we should emphasize environmental systems, attitudes, and policies and law which render members of our community disadvantaged. So how can we be more inclusive from the get-go in our design of our society, right? One of the most important things I've come across in terms of this literature is, and you see this with police brutality, the quote at the bottom right, racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Like when you step back and you think about what is the most serious consequence of racism, it's the reality that some people in our society are exposed at heightened levels to brutality, abuse, and ultimately to death. So I want us to think about that as we think about some of the other exposures that people might, frankly, how this might intersect with policing. But to me, that's a really powerful framing to keep in mind. So I said at the outset I wanted to think about a sociobiological approach, and basically, the color of our skin doesn't matter, our ethnicities doesn't matter. We know that these are social constructs, but the impact is in the ism, right? Being a woman shouldn't matter. The impact is in the sexism, right? Being queer, being gay, being bi, the impact is in the ism. It's not within the individual. So this is talking about the ways in which groups are positioned relatively and have power that fluctuates according to our societal notions around each other, right? So this is basically taking the biological inherentness of our oppression outside of ourselves and recognizing it's what's done to us, right? Again, and that's shaped by so many different variables. So a sociobiological approach emphasizes how societal inequalities generated by racism impact health directly, as well as by shaping psychological, behavioral, and biological vulnerability to disease. And that last phrase is important because there is a fair bit of literature, especially now coming out of the Centers for Disease Control, and there is a Surgeon General's report that looked at all the disparate health outcomes for people of color, First Nations in this country, and thinking about why are some people dying earlier than others? Why are some people exposed to greater violence than others, right? And that ties into the exposure to premature death frame. So I said this in one of my previous articles. This is a Fordham piece, and I just want to pause to read it because my theory is that racism is abusive. It's individually abusive, it's systematically abusive, and it's structurally abusive, and it's persistent. We know what abuse does to the body, to the mind, and the spirit, and I think when we think about abuse in different domains, we can sort of accept it more easily than when we think about racism as abuse. But what happens when someone is abused is there are all these biochemical responses and physiological responses, fight or flight, cortisol, and all these things, frankly, take a toll on one's health. And the racism-related health links are measurable and impactful. The residue of what I call societal puncture builds up in our bodies over time, and it's frankly corrosive, debilitating, and ultimately disabling. And if you were to go and look at all the medical literature along so many different health outcomes, you will see a difference for people of color, and in this community, for First Nations communities as well. And we have to pause and think, why is that? That's not inherent to anybody's biology or physiology. So it begs the question, what exactly is happening over someone's life to lead to what we're seeing in the medical literature? And I pause just because years ago, when I first started in the academy, I was at St. Louis University School of Law, and St. Louis University has the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but it has the #1 ranked health law center in the country. And so I was focused on this, and there's a med school, and we're doing all this work and looking at all the medical literature. And I would urge you, if you're interested in any of this, to really look at the medical literature, the psychological, the sociological, and just the disease, the epidemiology, the cardiology. There are some really interesting studies out there, and they're depressing. Okay, they're depressing. Because the reality is that these impacts take a toll on one's lifespan, one's suicidal ideation, and one's life expectancy. I think recently you've heard about the fact that Black women in the States, at least, have higher infant mortality, right? Their kids die, and they die during childbirth in the supposedly most developed country in the world, right? Why is that? Is that endemic to Black women? Right? So it begs some questions. So in terms of the criminal law aspect, Angela Y. Davis, who you've heard of, said, in the United States in particular, race has always played a central role in constructing presumptions of criminality. And in this country, Constance Backhouse is a professor at the University of Ottawa, where I went to law school, Order of Canada, Order of Ontario, noted historian, legal historian, said, and I want to ask you about this, because I can tell you about how it was growing up in Oshawa and Whitby, and then, and Durham region. A mythology of racelessness and stupefying innocence, these appear to be the twin pillars of the Canadian history of race. So the question is, what do you know? What do we learn here? Because I don't know if you're probably too, you might not remember, you might be a little too young to remember, but years ago, at least when I was growing up, there were the Canada Post ads that were all about the Underground Railroad, right? Sort of celebrating Canada as this utopia, and certainly in the States, people like to talk about us in that way, like this racial utopia. But what I didn't learn about until law school was the fact that we had slavery here. And I'll confess, I didn't learn about slavery in Canada until I was at law school at the University of Ottawa. All my years of elementary school here, all my years of high school here, my undergrad, and I took Canadian History 1 and 2 at U of T. I didn't learn about it until law school. So it's interesting now that we have the Canadian Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, right? So I went on their website and I'm like, what do you have about racism, right? And slavery. And it's relevant because at least in the States, not perfect, people talk about it and its legacies. They contest it, but they acknowledge it. So there's a shared, at least, commonality that this existed. And what are the repercussions, if any, right? So when Canadians, says the Canadian Human Rights Center in Winnipeg, an article on the website, talk about slavery, we often point to the pride in our role in the country played as a safe haven, referring to the Underground Railroad. This, however, is only half of the story. Like the United States, this land has its own history of slavery, and it's a history we should never forget. And of course, you can pull from the Canadian Archives, the Archives of Ontario, lots of fugitive slave ads, lots of sales ads. As a lawyer, I teach contracts. So I will teach, and we'll talk about in class, some of the contracts around sale of persons, right? The same legal principles apply. Offer, acceptance, consideration, promissory estoppel, unjust enrichment. Like, you just overlay it on the body of a person. And that was the case here as well. But problem is, we just don't talk about it a lot. Tell me if that's changed, because I hope it's changed. So this is a challenge, right? Because the criminal overlay, at least in the States, and again, not perfect, but there is a conversation around how policing became intricately involved with runaway slaves, for example, right? So contracts became enforced through the use of bounty hunters and police and early forms of people who would go after folks for a bounty or for an award. And this was I pulled this, this is from Nova Scotia, respect to the capture for $20 in the 1700s, which was a lot of money in 1794, of a runaway slave. Now, why do I show this? Again, the intersection of the medical legal history. So one of the things that I found fascinating, and I wrote about in a previous article, was in some of the early psychiatric literature. This is an esteemed psychiatrist and MD, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, wrote about, this is the construction of crazy, how drapetomania was a diagnosable disease during slavery in the States, causing Negroes to run away. Like, why would someone run away if they weren't crazy, right? And if they're crazy, surely we should go back and catch them, right? And bring them back to the plantation where they can be administered to, or at least watched. Similarly, diathesia aethiopica, rascality, was centralized a diagnosis around the hebetude, meaning lethargy or dullness of mind, and obtuse, meaning slow to understand, and dim-wittedness of Black people in particular. And it was a disease particular to us as Black people, and it came to be known in the common parlance as rascality. Okay? So I found all this really interesting in terms of the socio-medical literature and how the medical literature was infused into the criminal literature for, frankly, unjust and inequitable ends. And the reason, I know it's a long time ago, do I think modern-day police are running around going, let me talk to you about drapetomania and diathesia aethiopica? No, but I think it begs a question. How does history live if it lives at all, right? Should we be sensitive historically? Should we at least understand that as humans, this is what we did to each other, and by locating such factors and human agents and intentional decision-making and exercises of power, right, that we built in disparities into our existing world, right? And if we built it in as human beings, can we, however awesome the task, undo it? But I think it's important to know it, to be able to undo it. It's the hardest thing having a conversation with someone who doesn't acknowledge the same thing that you at least understand or know or have read about or have studied, right? So we have to expose these long, sometimes disturbing lineages behind just maybe our current way of thinking, okay? So noted historian George Rosen has said that whenever you notice something that's like happening, and it's happening, whatever it is, a social phenomenon, you have to sort of stop and say, is there a historical process behind that, right? Every social phenomenon, says George Rosen, is the result of a historical process. That is, societal factors operating over a period of time through us as humans interacting. And he says, as soon as you see these phenomena, account must be taken of the historical underpinning, basically, right? The historical facets. So what are some of the social phenomena that I have become increasingly preoccupied with, even though it depresses me? So I wonder, why is it that African American and black drivers in the States are twice as likely to be arrested? Why is it that Latinx people in the United States are more likely to receive a ticket than their white counterparts? Why is it that black and African Americans are 3 times more likely to be searched? Why is it that being black and unarmed does not render you less likely or equally likely to be shot, but 3.49% more likely to be shot by police? Why is it that while youth incarceration is decreasing, there has been a significant increase in the incarceration of African American and black youth in the United States, right? So see, these are some of the social phenomena. At the same time, and these numbers have grown, I'll be honest, since 2016, right? So since the election of President Trump, some have speculated that there is actually more stress. And maybe some people are happier, but some people are less happy, and there's concern around mental well-being at a more pitched level, which is sort of interesting when you think about how our sociological and our political environment or the tenor of our interactions may or may not impact us, right? So at least a few years ago in 2016, there was, I think, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of us had a diagnosable mental illness, right? And then you can go down the stats, and you can see that there is a fair prevalence, an understandable prevalence of mental vulnerability in our communities, right? And it should not therefore come as a surprise that 1 in 4 police encounters, fatal police encounters, ends the life of a person with a severe mental illness. Okay? The risk of being killed by police is 16 times greater for those of us with untreated mental illness. And one of the things I was reading about before I came over here was something, there was a stat that came out recently. It was reported in the American press. I don't know if it got much traction over here, but more vets, I believe, from American wars have killed themselves than been killed in war. Like there's so much, I think it's called suicidality, right, that has now been coming to the fore, which begs the question of what is going on. People are suffering, right? And how are we going to acknowledge that and treat it and be appropriately supportive as opposed to what we're seeing? So at least a quarter of the people shot and killed in 2016 had mental illness. And I will confess, and I want you to understand that in the States, these are the numbers we're talking about in terms of just fatal police encounters in the United States. So the bars are on the left is 2015, to the right, 2016. And understand that mental vulnerability, I would say, plays a role in a quarter of these fatalities involving police, right? But these are the numbers in the States, right? So last year, over 1,000 people were killed by police. In the States, the number, in Canada rather, the numbers is a lot less. 416 was the last stat that one of my research assistants pulled up. But so you can see the comparable US numbers over the same time frame. And we also know that the US population is over 328 million, and the Canadian population is over 36 million. So I don't know if it's entirely accountable societally or population, right? But the statistics still, 461 is, I would say, begs interrogation, okay? And in Canada, right, what do we know about racialized populations, mental health, and police violence? So of those 461 fatal police encounters, we know that the overwhelming majority were Black and Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples in this country. For example, in Toronto, Black people were killed in encounters with Toronto police. They account for 36.5% of those fatalities, even though the population in terms of Black people in Canada, in Toronto rather, is 8.3%. A study recently undertaken by CBC found that, quote, most Canadians killed in police encounters since 2000 had mental health or substance abuse issues. And what we know from the medical literature is that often people are self-medicating around their mental vulnerabilities. So, you know, they spiral and cascade into each other. You know, I'm a visual learner, so I think of like the ways in which a lava lamp morphs, right? They interact together. So sometimes people are suffering mentally, right? They have a mental vulnerability, and they're using drugs or drinking to offset and self-medicate, right? So sometimes you have to tease those out. Specifically, 42% of those who died in the 7-year span until 2017 were mentally distressed, while 45% were under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And in Calgary, there were particularly problematic percentages, right? 84% of those killed in police encounters struggled with mental vulnerability or substance abuse, or both. Similarly, in Canada, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has indicated that racial profiling here too is a systemic problem, especially for African Canadians, Black people, and Indigenous peoples and First Nations, right? And the available data, and I want to say available data intentionally, indicates that Canadians with mental health disabilities or vulnerabilities and who had reported poor or fair mental health experienced 4 times the rate of violent victimization. And when you layer this on where I started from in terms of the stressors that we all have and how the oppression and discrimination accumulates even more so in terms of inequities, there was a report in this country that also realized that racialized populations have higher rates of mental vulnerabilities than the national average. And that is echoed in a Surgeon General report in the state that was entirely devoted to the poor mental health of people of color in the United States. So the Surgeon General in one of the appendices was trying to figure out, like, why is that the case? And a lot of the report centers around various isms. Now, I said, to the extent we have data here, Canada, unlike the United States and the UK, has not historically collected stats in these areas. That is deeply problematic. At least when I was practicing here, the theory was that the collection of stats in and of itself was sexist or racist. That, I gotta say, is a huge problem because you cannot dashboard or benchmark anything over time. And it's awfully convenient because you cannot then have a conversation because you don't have a sense of what the numbers are and the impact is and the data over time. And therefore, you can't even judge the progress, right? So one would think that even if there was progress to be made, people would want to keep the data to say, look, we're making progress. So I would really urge an ongoing conversation around this notion because it's very hard to have these conversations without information. Sort of foundational for good lawyering too, right? I mean, just good advocacy. You need to know where you are to move forward. So the point of this conversation before I move forward a little bit more is really social justice is the foundation of public health, meaning without equality and without justice, we will inevitably have people in our communities who are suffering physiologically, physically, and mentally. Right, so we often don't talk about public health and justice in that vein, but I want to bring this to the situational disobedience frame. 2 things are operative in a police encounter. So let me explain one thing. So I recently hired an assistant dean for diversity, inclusion, and affinity relations at my school. And she worked at St. Louis University, where I used to work before Ferguson, when Mike Brown was shot, right? And she was telling me a story of, St. Louis University is right downtown St. Louis, and there was a police in pursuit notice that went out to the community to tell people to sort of shelter in place because the police were pursuing a person who was thought to be armed, and they thought the person might have run onto the campus, right? And it was interesting because she was telling me how the white students and the black students responded to that differently, right? The white students, at least the people with whom she was engaged, were like, oh my gosh, there might be a criminal roaming around with a weapon. The black students were like, oh my God, there's police on campus. I need to be careful because they might think it's me with the right? So, and that, for me, that was so, like, I had the exact same thought when she was telling the story. Like, there's going to be police roaming around thinking that I have a weapon. And I'm a dean, and I'm not 18. But I will tell you, I had the exact same thought when she was telling the story of that particular shelter in place or stay put notice that went out. So there's a couple things going on. That particular interaction with police for people of color is often fraught, and we see how through the felonizing process or the societal identity construction, people become there's an escalation to which police often respond with violence. But I want to just acknowledge, based on the story I just told you, that even if you are not in that situation, just hearing about it, seeing it, or you come into it fully whole, fully sane, whatever that means, you can debilitate. It's stressful. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I'm pulled over, which we all are sometimes, it doesn't matter who we are, it's stressful. When I see a police cruiser, I start to perspire. I get nervous. I've done nothing. So the question is that normal? Is that abnormal? Maybe I'm just paranoid. How is it debilitating, disabling, and is it worthy of your rumination? Some of you might say no. Some of you might think, well, we need to think about this a little bit further, right? There's a law professor named Chris Hennings from Georgetown Law Center, and she is in another clip, and she says one of the reasons that this is so important that we stop shackling and I don't know if they do that in Canada anymore, but in the States they still with your feet shackle and handcuff front or back, especially kids under 18 and certainly under 16, it's deeply traumatizing to them and people who see it. And you sort of think one of the images that didn't show is you have these kids and then you have like 4 large grown men around them and they're shackled and they're being taken into the car and their heads are put down. And so they're starting to look at the sequelae, as they call it in the literature, of having experienced those images as a young person, right? And there's this clip, and I intentionally don't play because it always makes me cry. I'm going to just be honest with it. There's a young boy in one of the states, and I can't remember which one it was, but he's arrested, and he's like a kid. And he's handcuffed, and he's made to sit on the ground, and then the police stand him up, and he wets himself. And it's so deeply traumatizing for like everybody, but for him, right? And then someone says, oh, you peed your pants, like that kind of thing. And when you step back and you think about all the traumatic things that happened to you when you're a kid that you remember, right? Like someone stole my hat, someone took my this, someone took my boots, someone took, you know what I mean? All that kind of stuff that happens, and which you still remember. And then you think about something like this in public, at the playground with your friends, you know what I mean? And like wetting yourself in public with the police all around. And it's just like, I can't get that out of my head. And I know it's no one died, but you just think about what happens to that child and their family and the people around them that witness things like that. And it's not a fatality, right? And thank goodness for that. But I'm saying, are there ways in which we inflict pain and suffering and trauma on each other short of fatalities as well? And how does that live in our bodies, right? That's the question. How does that live in us? So one of the things that you'll see in a lot of these instances is it begs the question of what we call in law proportionality, right? An immediacy of response. So for any of you that are interested in studying the law or who are already studying law in some capacity, when you talk about self-defense and the use of lethal force, 2 things are critical to the examination. One, proportionality. So the mantra is you can't bring a gun to a fist fight, okay? Similarly, immediacy or imminence. Like someone can't threaten me today and I show up at their house next week. There needs to be an immediacy to the threat, right, that provokes my proportionate response. The challenge is, in this context, those frames tend to fall away because the police often articulate, and it's accepted, as either an excuse or a justification, which are 2 important bits of nomenclature at law, an excuse or justification for the lethal violence. And I just want to acknowledge, I won't play all the videos, these instances of police interactions that turn fatal are even more pronounced and precarious when you're dealing with transgender individuals, for whom there have been a number of lethal instances in the last, in particular, 4 to 5 years. And if you do a quick search, you'll unfortunately find a number of instances, including Kiwi Herring in St. Louis, who was shot by police when they said that she came at them with a knife. So again, if you can't bring a gun to a fist fight, what does that mean in the context of police use of lesser types of responses? So in working with police, it's interesting because they are trained to shoot center body mass, meaning here. So it begs, and we'll get to this, some alternative theories around response, right? And recently, police have had tasers as an alternative option for responding to an armed or violent suspect. And we'll talk a little bit more about tasers as an alternative source. But I want to just at least hold that possibility in terms of police training as something we need to think about. And I also want to acknowledge, as I try to get through some of this before we open it up to Q&A, that often what we're seeing is that police are being called to help people. And in one of the articles that I wrote, I talk about sort of the medical modality, meaning calling the police to help someone go to a hospital for psychological or psychiatric treatment, right? There's also a family modality. Someone is behaving erratically and you stabilize them with medicine, you bring them back to their family, right? And then there's a criminal modality, which is often, then you take someone to the jail, to county, to the prison, right? And then the disciplinary modalities where someone is shot or tased to death or suffocated on the street. So police have these various modalities that they can use, especially when they know they're being called to help someone, such as Daniel Jacobs, who was shot to death in by Mesa police. He is alleged to have lunged at police with a knife, and he was transitioning, and the police were called to help Daniel, and unfortunately, the encounter resulted in Daniel's death. Similarly, parents called to help their 18-year-old schizophrenic teen. He was tased initially, then he was shot when the police said he tried to run away and resist. He was 18. Dorothy Danners, and I'm going to wind down. I recognize we started a little late, but in the interest of time, I want to cover a couple more things. When I was going to law school in Ottawa, there was a case, or maybe it was in Columbia, but Eleanor Bumpers was a 66-year-old black woman who was shot and killed in her Bronx apartment. She was alleged to have pulled a gun, I believe, on the officers. This case with Deborah, Danners, is reminiscent of that case insofar as Deborah was also a 66-year-old black woman in her Bronx apartment. And it's strange how history, again, repeats itself, who was alleged to have lunged at the officers, in this case, with a knife, and she was shot in her home. Now, again, it sort of begs the question, especially when you have a senior citizen. And I know you can be, strong and nimble as a 66-year-old, but it begs the question of whether there's anything else the police could do other than to shoot someone who is 66 and holding a knife. There was a recent settlement in this case, and in fact, Mayor de Blasio and the chief of police came out pretty quickly and said that the police were behaved inappropriately and did not follow de-escalation policies in this particular case. Similarly, I won't even go into the cases involving people who are hearing impaired and cannot hear the officers' instructions or understand necessarily the officer's instructions. If you search it, there are unfortunately cases that you will find in this vein. There was a case, this case did not lead to death, thankfully, but there was a recent case in Oklahoma with a Latino man that did lead to his being shot by police, despite the fact that his neighbors, he was walking around and his neighbors were saying he can't hear you. So again, if you're interested in studying any of this, there are far too many cases for you to consider. Whatever your perspective is, however it comes out, they're worthy of our contemplation. One of the things that I'm interested in thinking about going forward with my work in this area is the amount of settlements that cities have been paying out for police brutality articulations over the last couple of decades is significant. So to the extent that people talk about taxpayers' money being used to do this or taxpayers' money being used to do that, certainly there is an argument or at least a conversation around these suits, which are actually often quite significant in terms of the damage awards that are paid out by cities, even if the police officers are not ultimately convicted, okay? And usually there's both, right? But rarely do we see this type of conviction. So the question is, like, how are you feeling in your body right now, right? So, because one of the things that is increasingly being noticed is the fact that there are higher levels of PTSD in neighborhoods where unemployment, poverty, war on drugs, and discrimination and depression are more evident. I won't show the Sandra Bland interaction, I think most of you have probably seen it. She's pulled over for not signaling on a lane change. Do you all know this one? Yeah, okay, so Sandra Bland is going to her new job at Florida A&M, where she's an alumna. She changes lanes because she says the police officer is driving up really fast behind her and she's trying to get out of the way. So she says she moves over to the right lane so he can get by, but then the articulation is, he says you didn't signal to come right. And she's like, well, I was trying to get out of your way. And anyway, it devolves. The interaction devolves really quickly, and sort of the rest is history. She's found 3 days later after he takes her into the jail cell to have committed suicide. So there's some controversy around that. The family says it wasn't suicide. What we do know from Sandra's Facebook page, because is that she confessed to being depressed precisely about police brutality. And Sandra Speaks was her Facebook page, and it's still being continued, but you can still go through it. And in one of them, she says, you know, I just got to confess, y'all, I'm suffering, as I say here, I'm suffering from something that some of y'all might be dealing with right now. It's a little bit of depression as well as PTSD. I've been real stressed out over the past couple weeks. And she goes on to talk about in other instances of Sandy Speaks that she is getting sick and tired of watching black men die on the street and being chokehold. And she talks about it. It's really profound, and she's saying, I'm struggling with this. One of the things that's obvious, whether it's the lane change or whether it's someone calling someone to come to a home, whether it's an ostensible burglary, someone saying, I've been burgled, is whenever these interactions take place, they're often fraught. And proactive police stops are predicated on a very low level of suspicion. And the question becomes, why do they escalate in this way? And sometimes you have to get to the point. Some people are getting to the point where they're saying, don't call police. So I don't know if you saw the neighbor who called the police to come and help his neighbor, Atachana Jefferson, who was shot at 3 in the morning by the police officer. And the neighbor's like, why did I call the police? I called you to check to see if she was okay because I saw her door was ajar. But it's a problem if people are getting to the point where they're saying, I'm just not going to call the police anymore because I don't know what you're going to do with people of color should you be called. But that neighbor now, he's in all these interviews, he's like, I shouldn't have called, and people are saying what's worse, why did you call the police? Are you crazy for calling the police? Like, you're a black man. Did you not know not to call the police? We can find all this, right? Recently, you probably saw last week or a couple weeks ago, a professor called the police, the campus security, on one of his black students in his business class for not moving seats. So he was at in the back row. He had plugged in his laptop to charge. He had his backpack open. Someone left a seat up here. So he said, I want you to come and sit at the front. The student refused to leave. And the police officer called the police. This campus security, the professor called the campus security. Now, thankfully, nothing came of it in terms of violence, but it begs the question of, and he actually goes on to say in these interviews, if you pull it up, Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, he says, I can't believe this professor called the police. Do you not know what happens to black people when you call the police or the campus security? He articulates it himself as a student in this business program. And that was fairly recently. So hopefully you're getting my concern. It's not that I have all the answers, but my concern is when you take race and racism, and when you take what is often perceived to be situational disobedience, rascality, think Laquan McDonald having the audacity to walk away from Jason Van Dyke, and when you take mental vulnerability and you layer it all together in that intersection, right, there is societal disablement. There is something that we need to deconstruct and stop from escalating. People should not be dying at this intersection. We've got to figure this out. This is, I've been looking at this since 2000s, and I know there are doctors and public health people that have been looking at this much longer than I have, right? The police discretion is a challenge. The consequences are a challenge. There is grave potential for abuse. Sandra Day O'Connor of the American Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, indicated when we racially profile, when we over-police, we have to recognize that we set ourselves up. Remember that quote? Premature fatalities, premature exposure to violence and death, right? So we have to take racial profiling seriously because usually no good comes of that. Usually there's not sunshine, happiness, rainbows, and lollipops that comes from those interactions. Someone, no matter what, comes away feeling damaged, right? Indeed, there has been concern about, well, why did this person run? Well, why did this person run? And Supreme Court justices in the states have also recognized that for certain people in certain situations, it's perfectly normal to want to run from police. Maybe we've got to stop thinking that's abnormal. Clearly you're guilty. Why would you run away from police? Especially given what we know about some of these interactions. Okay, so I want to acknowledge those, and I want to just wind down also by recognizing that there is a growing understanding that we're all so connected on our devices, and we've seen, like when I was growing up, I didn't see people getting killed regularly on the news. Back in the day, we'd watch like eyewitness news from Buffalo, right? And you'd hear about shootings and you hear about fatalities in Toronto and stuff, but you didn't see Philando Castile bleeding out in his car, right? You didn't see Mike Brown being shot. You didn't see Eric Gartner saying, "I can't breathe." The point is, what does seeing real, like people dying, do to us? Does it desensitize us? Is it funny? Do we just get like so used to seeing people die on our social media feeds that we don't respond? Or is it also in some way that we are experiencing vicarious trauma? And if so, how do we recognize that and take care of ourselves and our loved ones, right? And just recognizing that this is a real topic of conversation for many communities who are the people dying, who represent the people dying on those feeds. All right, I won't go into some more of the public health literature. I will just say I really think we need to think about interdisciplinary approaches to studying these interactions. And as a lawyer, I say that humbly because sometimes as lawyers we think we know all the answers and we don't. I think we need to look at the mental health literature and what psychiatrists and psychologists have to say. I think we have to look at the public health literature. I think we have to be in conversation with police and law enforcement. I think we have to be in conversation with criminologists. I think we have to be in conversation with disability rights activists and experts. I think only then will we come to some, and frankly, activists in the various communities who are most impacted, to think about how we come to some outcome that is more just and that we all can take pride in, as opposed to not even, like, just, I can't stand to watch this anymore. I don't want to know about it. We're going to sort of do what we say in law is the ostrich and bury our heads in the sand and not want to deal with it. So I want to thank you for your attention and thank you for allowing me to share some of my research. Hopefully there are things that we can come together around and thinking how we sort of problem solve through this. I think that especially for you folks who are in the midst of your studies, there's fodder for thought. I don't think my generation has solved these problems. And I think, being at a tech university as well, it sort of begs the question of how and whether technology can help in any ways. When dash cam videos and police-worn cameras were coming out, there was a lot of controversy around them. And a lot of people in the community thought they would be used against us. So it begs further contemplation of whether there are other things that you can see based on your facility with technology being born digital natives, as opposed to what my generation's called digital pioneers. Like, we can use it, but we're not nearly as nimble as you all. To just think about what are the intersections with what you know better than we know around justice pursuits, right? Are there different ways that you would come at this if you are the chiefs of the police or the crown attorney or the people being running the defense? And I really do think those conversations need to include those who are often most at risk, and they tend to be folks in your age demographics. So I think some of the solutions have to come from your age demographics as well. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts, but thank you for listening.